Hello, and welcome to this panel discussion about evaluating defense in-depth strategies in our Cybersecurity for Industrial Systems series, sponsored by Rockwell Automation. My name is Matthew, and I will be your Global Spec moderator, and I want to review a few housekeeping items with you before we begin. Please take a moment to familiarize yourself with the operation of the user interface for today's webinar. The large window with the heading Presentation in the upper left is the primary window. Just to the right of the main presentation window is the speaker bio window with background information on today's presenters. Just below that is the Q&A window. At any time during the presentation, you can enter a question into the box in the lower section of the window and click Submit. Your question will be placed in the queue to address when we get to the Q&A session. At the bottom of your screen, you will see additional buttons to enhance your webinar experience. To see what a particular button does, just place your mouse pointer over it and a tooltip will appear with a description of the button's function. Now I would like to introduce our moderator for the Cybersecurity for Industrial Systems series, Edgar Sauter. Edgar is the Senior Director of New Product Technology at CSA Group. He and his team look to the technology horizon for new developments and applications that could present opportunities for CSA's test, inspection, and certification business. To read more about Edgar or any of our presenters today, please look at the speaker bio window right next to the main presentation window. And with that, I would like to pass things along to Edgar to lead us through today's discussion on evaluating defense in-depth strategies. Edgar, welcome to today's event.
Thank you, Matt, for the introduction. My name is Edgar Sauter, Senior Director of New Product Technology for CSA Group, and I will be the moderator of this roundtable. I'm so happy to have you here as we discuss this very interesting topic about cybersecurity, defense in depth, and how it is used to protect infrastructure and industrial networks. Today, we have a good team of experts that are going to discuss this topic, and we will learn from their experiences and ideas. So we have with us Daniel Jablansky. Daniel is a non-resident fellow at the Cyber Statecraft Initiative of the Atlantic Council Scopecraft Center for Strategy and Security, and an OT cybersecurity strategist at Nozomi Networks. Daniel has also served as the president of the North Texas section of the International Society of Automation. She holds a master's degree in international security from the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver and a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Missouri, Columbia. We also have Gregory Wilcox. So Greg is Principal Application Engineer for Strategic Development at Rockwell Automation. He leads the effort to establish tested and validated convergent CPWE architectures to enable reliable and secure industrial Internet of Things and industrial IT architectures. He is a thought leader with extensive experience designing and implementing industrial automation network and security solutions for the past 37 years. We also have with us David Tajuri. David is a cyber R&D manager for Elta Systems. David has spent almost 20 years developing cybersecurity solutions in the Israeli defense industry. He has 30 years of experience as a software developer, system engineer, and system architect. He is a professional with a Master in Science with honors in computer science, and is a PhD student at the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, specializing in network and system risk assessment. And last but not least, we have Mike Hoffman. Mike has over 20 years of experience focused on oil and gas networks with roles in downstream, upstream, and global technical leadership. His past titles have included Principal ICS Security Engineer, Controls and Automation Specialist, Process CEMS Analyzer Specialist, and Instrumentation and Electrical Technician. He has a master's degree in Information Security Engineering from the SANS Technology Institute and is a SANS instructor in development for the ICS curriculum. So Daniel, Greg, David, and Mike, thank you very much for being with us today, sharing your knowledge and experience with our audience. So a layered security approach is a requirement for industrial and infrastructure networks. In this technique, it is required to have a constant self-assessment, especially when networks are now widestream and diverse, given the expansive nature of industrial networks and the remote work. Now, as threats change and evolve, so the strategies, equipment, and behaviors used in an approach, in a defense in depth approach. Today, we will discuss all the challenges involved in implementing this approach in industrial and infrastructure networks. But before we start, let's acknowledge our sponsors for today. Rockwell Automation is a global leader in industrial automation and digital transformation solutions. Rockwell's domain of expertise in operation technology and industrial environment afford Rockwell the opportunity to advise companies on their OT cybersecurity strategy and be a supplier of industrial automation cybersecurity services and solutions. For more information, visit rockwellautomation.com. This webinar is hosted by Global Spec, the world's largest online industrial destination for product sourcing and engineering information. So without further delay, let's start with our roundtable today. And I want to start with a simple question for the benefit of those ones joining us today that may not have too much knowledge about this topic. And this question will go to Danielle. Danielle, could you please help us understand what is defense in depth?
Sure, thanks, Edgar. And thank you to the sponsors and everyone else for having me here today. At its core, defense in depth is a strategy with various methods for introducing stopgaps, which we typically call controls, for security across your organization. And so we talk about that in a way where we layer controls that cross-cut people, technology, and processes, and relies on tools and policies to ensure robust and redundant protection. Those tools and policies may include things you've heard of, like endpoint security or access controls, network monitoring, and segmentation. The list kind of goes on and on. But which mechanisms you choose really depends on the type and complexity of your organization, the assets that you have, and the networks that you operate on.
Thank you, Danielle. Now, in our conversation before, you mentioned something about how those strategies have evolved. Would you please give us an idea of how are the strategies today different from the past?
Sure, I would love to. There are quite a few ways that the defense in depth strategy has evolved over time. It's more advanced today with tools that in cybersecurity have become more automated, so that they save more time for analysts to review the data instead of kind of hunt for the data and put it all together. It's more dynamic and integrated, right? Instead of static and kind of living in siloed, Excel spreads across your organization. There's less of a focus on perimeter security, where you kind of, draw your moat around the castle and prevent anyone from getting in, and more of a dynamic focus on all of the operations that go on inside. There's also a less on-premises focus, which you mentioned before, in kind of the remote access and a lot of cloud adoption. We see that less in industrial networks, but it's not happening. And another thing that's different is that we can now combine information from many tools for things like event management and broader situational awareness that is different from, roughly 10, 15 years ago. And we're also realizing that the value of security tools can maximize business functionality and reduce downtime and inefficiencies. So security data actually has value beyond just securing the component or process that you're trying to secure within your organization. And lastly, I would say it's also becoming more creative. So with things like anomaly detection and credential segmentation and some zero trust efforts, which I know is another panel that Rockwell will be sponsoring, we're beginning to use contextualized data and customizable rule sets in the way that we kind of develop the controls, right? Instead of just having a one-size-fits-all security control for every company and organization, there's a lot more customization that goes into that. So I hope that answers your question in a variety of ways.
That is a very comprehensive answer. And we will probably jump into those details as we follow the discussion. But one other basic thing that I want to define for the benefits of all of us and our audience is what is the difference between actually dealing with industrial infrastructure networks versus the normal IT networks. What is unique about protecting this industrial and infrastructure network? And this is a question for the group. I don't know who wants to answer and who wants to jump into that answer.
I'll jump in first, and perhaps some other folks can join in as well. I think one of the things when we think about OT networks or industrial networks, so a lot of times if you're new to this, you'll hear multiple different phrases or terms that we use. We love acronyms in this space. So ICS, or industrial control system networks. We have OT, or operational technology networks. No matter what you call them, they are there for the sole purpose of running that business, that operation, that plant, that substation, that transmission system, generator system. So those networks, those computers, those systems below it, those controllers, It's all there for a certain purpose, and it's for real-time operation. So when we think about doing, putting in security, adding on security from the ground up, it's all about for that the mission of that environment. So that the environment could be, again, a chemical plant or a refinery where you're 24/7, 365 processing of materials. And so when we think about defense in depth, we think about that in the context of these systems that are running, producing product, producing materials, producing the energy that we as a society use. So in that regard, these networks have to be very, very resilient. They have to have high levels of redundancy. For security controls, the security controls can't, and IT side, when we think about, patching, which we have to do all the time, patching requires a system to be taken offline to be brought back up. That's an outage. In OT systems, some systems can handle outages, some of them cannot. So when we think about the availability of time requirements and on all of those things, and then the lifetime requirements of some of these systems, we see systems that are 25, 30 years old. I recently saw a very, very old PLC, that one of them that I just trained on when I was a technician, just coming out of high school, and it was still operating in a plant. So cool to see that the equipment's still there, but at the same time, that is what we deal with in these environments. Long-lasting, long lifetime systems. So the difference is really the mission critical applications, resiliency, uptime, and so forth.
Thank you, Meg. Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
I just want to build upon that because those were all great comments. In that, especially the lifespan, is that obviously in the IT space it could be a 3 to 5 year turnover in technology, but in many plants, industrial automation control system devices can be there for 1, 2, or possibly 3 decades. So they have a lot of unique requirements, especially to protect those, and they have the open by default mentality, or the everything is kind of open as far as communications and basically implied trust. So that's important. But also, as Mike had talked about, the when it comes to OT versus IT, the concept of availability, 24/7 operations. In many industries, you just cannot take it down to go out there and apply patches or make updates for those. But even Mike touched on the patching policies as far as doing it for during uptime in the IT space versus during scheduled preventive maintenance days and so forth. But also, how do you make sure you qualify your industrial applications against those operating system patches? Doing those in the labs, those have unique requirements. But also, an important one is the different types of policy engines. When you look at policy-based enforcement, policy engines within OT are a lot different than IT. They may use the same IEEE or the Internet Engineering Task Force or the IETF standards. However, they're different. OT doesn't understand IT and IT doesn't understand OT. So there are some differences that have to be taken into consideration. As Danielle mentioned earlier, one size does not fit all.
That's a good point, Greg. Now that I have you there, I want to ask you, because of this defense in depth includes different layers of security. So, and I remember in a conversation that we have, you were talking about those different layers. Could you please expand a little bit to explain people listening to this conversation, what are those layers that professional needs to consider when they are setting up a defense in depth approach?
Well, some of those layers, it could be just from device hardening. So you think about hardening devices themselves, taking a look at acquiring devices which meet certain standards for hardening, choosing vendors who are things like ISA IEC 62443-4-1 certified, which means that our basically policies, procedures basically are documented and they're auditable within our companies. And there's other requirements from those standards as well, but Rockwell Automation has an example of those. But also choosing products which may be 4-2 certified. Basically kind of helps you in the overall journey when it comes to hardening your devices. And one last note here, just because a vendor or a device is not 4-1 or 4-2 certified doesn't mean that that device itself or that vendor is not capable of accomplishing your goals. It just means you have more investigation to do. There's more burden put on you. Open does not mean easy. Standard does not mean uniformity. There are differences in those. So those are things to kind of think about from those as far as devices, but also from a network perspective. There are certain things I mentioned earlier, different policy engines. You may have different policy engines when it comes to trust communication between Ethernet IP devices. And a good example, Rockwell Automation, technology called SIP security, a common industrial protocol. So SIP security communication between devices, as well as basic user authentication, which is a lot different than being applied higher in the architecture by OT persona when it comes to their policy engine. So those are the things to consider as far as defense in depth, device hardening, network, but there's also the non-technical controls in defense in depth, things along lines of personnel and the policies and procedures, as well as the awareness training to ensure that industrial operations personnel understand cybersecurity threats. They understand how to recognize them, and more importantly, what do they do when they come across those? So it's multiple layers of defense at different levels of the architecture. So for me, a key takeaway is that no single product, technology, methodology, nor strategy can fully secure an industrial automation and control system application. It requires multiple layers of a holistic defense, multiple layers of diverse technologies applied at different levels in the architecture, applied by different personas, that whole OT-IT convergence. Sorry for getting wordy there, but it's a combination of a lot of things.
It sounds a kind of a complex setting, like to put together a whole defense in depth approach for an organization. Now, given the effort that is required to do this, and this is probably a question for David, because we were talking about the whole process of keeping up with cybersecurity. How often does an organization have to review those settings and probably touch them, tune them, even re-implement them if they have to?
Okay, so there are two aspects to this question. One is updating the security practices and running them. For the first aspect, the organization should define its security needs and resources that it will require for this security. It means money and people. It should check the potential tools that will provide the required security according to the allocated resources, and select the most appropriate tools. Since this can be a demanding process, I would recommend evaluating the security needs once a year, or when the organization goes through main changes. As for the second aspect, I mean, how often to run the selected tools? Threats change frequently, and almost every day vulnerabilities are exposed. So I recommend selecting security tools that can run continuously, searching for new vulnerabilities, risk and the risk in the network, and suggesting actions to reduce this risk. This action can be patching software or fixing some misconfigured system. And in this way, the organization can get to the best results.
Thank you, David. Well, I think up to this point, we have done a good job defining the concept, explaining to the audience what is involved in putting together a defense in depth approach in an organization, the difference between IT and OT network, and how to implement on each of them. So I think it's a good moment to probably jump into a little bit more on what the strategies are today, what are those technologies used today for this defense in depth. So the first question now goes for you, Greg. What are those leading technologies and strategies used today for defense in depth?
Just to kind of build upon what Danielle had already said, one size does not fit all. To me, it kind of starts out by looking at both the technical and non-technical controls. And we've all touched on this to some degree. To determine what your cybersecurity posture is that posture is going to be based on what are the companies or industrial operations business drivers. Basically, what is their tolerance to risk? What kind of regulatory compliance or application requirements are they going to have? So it's really coming up with those policies and procedures for those. And one aspect of that would be to establish a multi-persona or multi-discipline group to develop what these security posture is. And that can be made up of operational technology personnel, such as engineering, operations, maintenance, as well as, I would say, safety, but also the different OT persona. It could be IT network engineers, and those. So really come down to, what is those applications, develop those policies for basically, policy-based access control. Next would be like a technical control. So Dan, you already hit on this as far as dynamic policy-based access control, because things are changing all the time. Different personnel, your onboarding personnel, different remote experts come in. You're moving from on-perimeter to cloud-based applications. How do you make sure you enforce those access controls, but also make it very granular? Try to limit those kind of aspects. So policy-based access control for granularity. So a good example, the minimal. If I'm a maintenance person, I may want to have read-only. If I'm an engineer, read writes, maybe some type of architecture, I may have to go in there and update and actually change my devices. So that's another one of those. But as Mike talked about earlier, is that we have a lot of legacy devices out there. So you need to zone those. There have to be different, I would say, compensating measures to account for those devices. So you want to create smaller zones. You want to move away from, where everything is trusted. You have smaller trust zones, and possibly even apply policy-based authentication to access those different trust zones. So again, it's more of a technical control. Another one is going to be from technical, the continuous monitoring is very important. Monitoring for multiple things. So one is actually to monitor the networks. There's different tools for those. Look at the data flows. Who is talking to who? Who's new? What is that conversation saying? Something called deep packet inspection. What are they really trying to do? Is somebody trying to monitor a controller to just monitor the values, which is okay, or they try to go online to do a program change, which is not authorized? So those kind of aspects, so that continuous monitoring, but also from a asset management perspective, how do we go out there and make sure that there are no unauthorized changes? So from asset management, again, Rock Automation, our tool, Factory Talk Asset Center, go out there and look for those changes. Was there basically a change made that shouldn't have been done? And as far as some of the network monitoring tools, Rock Automation, we work with Cisco CyberVision as well as Clarity's continuous threat detection. Again, a lot of great tools. So again, as far as policy procedures, non-technical, it's going to be policy-based access control, zoning or certification for smaller zones of trust, and then continuous monitoring.
That's great. Thank you, Greg. Now, I have a question. In those layers and personas that you mentioned, it's a very interesting concept because, I remember from my past life as a product manager, we always considered personas when we were targeting how to sell a product. In this case, you're considering personas to see how you can better approach the users, the stakeholders for every layer. Is that correct?
That is correct. And actually, this is sometimes it's an aspect which is greatly often overlooked. Is that it's important to recognize that there is organizational, cultural, and technical differences between different types of personas. So again, operation technology, information technology, operations, maintenance, engineering, as well as safety I mentioned earlier, IT network engineers, even IT security architects, they're just a little bit different. And so again, I mentioned this a little earlier, I guess everybody has, as far as the best practice is again to form that multi-persona, multidisciplinary team to define posture with policies and procedures and awareness training for those. And the reason this is important is that it really starts with operations. Operations understands the process flow. Operation understands what devices, what applications are required to meet certain tasks or functions. They also understand how those need to be organized. Operation also understands how the different aspects or zones need to communicate. Good example, processing or material handling or basically, packaging. How do those areas actually need to work? Again, it's a kind of a concepts of secure zones and conduits, but also they need to understand operation understands who needs to access those assets. What rights should they have? What granular set of access controls should they have for those? So that's one of the key roles that operations plays. That's why they're a key member of the overall cybersecurity team, that multidisciplinary cybersecurity team. I just kind of build upon that a little bit more, is that maintenance is very important in this, is that companies are trying to drive higher overall equipment effectiveness, or OEE. And so maintenance is tasked to reduce mean time to repair. And they do that by quickly identifying, diagnosing, troubleshooting, and sometimes replacing devices. So there needs to be policies and procedures in place to permit maintenance to have frictionless access, either physically or electronically, to devices for those, again, to be able to keep up those. And then, as we all mentioned earlier before, basically the control system engineers, network engineers, and IT security architects to implement those different type of policy-based access controls, whether it's OT or IT. But for me, a key takeaway is that open and early dialogue is key for successful industrial cybersecurity practices. Again, it's important to form that multidisciplinary team to be able to build that posture and policies.
Thank you, Greg. Now, when it comes to technologies themselves to prevent the attacks, Mike, I think you and I had a conversation before about those technologies. Could you please share with the audience what are those technologies that you mentioned that could be preventive for attacks? Like you would talk about firewalls, endpoints, backups, etc. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. So when we think about preventative, we're thinking about something that is going to stop an adversary from carrying out their capabilities. And essentially, and when we think about defense in depth, I mean, that's the whole point. Defense in depth is all about lining up different technologies, and it doesn't have to be a technical thing. It can be soft, it can be a process or procedure, it can be an administrative control that is thwarting those types of adversarial activities, attacks, and so forth. And when we really consider the OT environment, one of the main things, and the first thing that I look at, so, you know, I work with Dragos, principal industrial consultant. A lot of the work that I do is, in my current role, is going out and doing security assessments, architecture reviews. So one of the things I look at for a defense in depth type of an architecture is the boundary firewall. And I know that we're moving away from, you know, this IT OT, you know, hard and fast boundary where we have a firewall in place because we're moving to the cloud. I've seen many manufacturing environments lately where half of their systems were hosted in either a private cloud or on-prem or somewhere else. So lots and lots amount of interaction between IT OT systems. Nevertheless, so that boundary is still a very effective area to prevent an attack, and that boundary is commonly a firewall. So first of all, we have a firewall. So we have a firewall in place. One of the things that I see is, though, is a lot of times people will put a firewall in place. They won't understand the ports and protocols. They don't have ability to monitor their networks to identify if their preventative controls are actually working or set up properly. So there's a firewall in place. So that is one of the key things, the first things that I look at. And also what kind of inspections is going on those devices. A lot of folks, unfortunately, in the automation space, they understand that this PLC needs to talk to this HMI, or this historian needs to talk across IT to OT, or their MMS application needs to go across and track devices and packages and so forth. But when we think about how these protocols actually work, I see all the time firewall rules are bidirectional. So it's just that understanding that, how, like TCP and UDP works and how firewalls should be actually set up. And so a lot of times we see in these preventative type devices that they're allowing way too much traffic to come across. So, but a preventative area is that firewall. It's going to inspect traffic. It's going to inspect it based off of the rule set that you provide. Also, we're coming out with a lot of good firewalls these days. A lot of companies they're doing applications inspections, and especially important for this industry. They're looking at protocols for OT. Where you asked the question earlier about what's the difference between IT and OT. The huge difference is protocols. I think we talked about SIP security here earlier. SIP, the protocol that Rockwell uses to talk between PLCs, TCP 44818 and 2222 on UDP. Those protocols. I mean, for us as an OT practitioner, when we see those, we know that that's a Rockwell device, and this is what it's doing. It's either remote I/O or these types of communications going on. So the protocols are different, and then how you inspect on that preventative device is different. Some of these protocols can easily be inspected at the application layer. Others, it's kind of challenging. But at that primary area, look at the boundary. Understand what you're allowing to go across that IT/OT boundary, what an adversary can do if that device isn't put in place properly. Also, and I know I'm getting wordy here, but right underneath there, you have a DMZ. And that area.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
Yep. So that's that other area where what we're trying to do is when you think about defense and depth. So a DMZ, that concept of is we don't want to allow inbound communications. And when I say inbound, I'm talking about from the cloud or from your IT business network going down below, going down into your OT side. We don't like direct connectivity coming across, because as an adversary can easily use those direct connections to essentially land and expand their attacks, to come across, to easily pivot down from IT to OT. So we try to make it harder for them. And that's what defense in depth is all about, is making it hard for the adversary. So one of the ways you do that is you put in a demilitarized zone. So anytime you have cross connectivity between IT and OT, we try, this can't be done with all applications, but we try to terminate connections within that DMZ. So a connection coming across will terminate in some sort of a server, and it'll reconnect going outbound to the IT side. Remote access is one of the key areas for having a DMZ. Often we find, especially when you get into the manufacturing sectors and so forth, a lot of their systems are, there's contracts in place for these third parties and the vendors to take care of their systems. So you see a lot of times, VPNs over to, cooling system providers, to plant, equipment OEMs and so forth, to come in and remotely inspect, troubleshoot, and so forth. All of this happens through all these, VPNs and external connections coming in down to the factory floor. So being able to know who's coming in, to ensure your controls. Now we're talking about remote access. Two-factor authentication comes into play, the importance of that. And then once the vendor drops in, making sure that part of defense in depth and segmentation is ensuring that these vendors can only access their equipment on the factory floor, and only access when authorized and permitted. I see oftentimes that vendors will have access into even a jump box in a DMZ, but that jump box doesn't have tight controls over what it can then access. So now that one vendor can access all the plant floor. And so different areas. So we start at that preventative spot where you have your firewalls in place between IT and OT. We have defenses in there for not only for the perimeter, but when we get into the internal systems on the devices themselves. Quite often I find that host-based firewalls are turned off, but firewalls on the host, those kind of things like that. And then running endpoint detection type software to understand if certain processes are being kicked off where they shouldn't be. And hardening is even another one of those areas where we think about preventative in nature. If the service isn't running, you can't compromise the service. So making sure that you're preventing from at different spots within the network, and then even firewalls within the network where we're talking about from different manufacturing lines, being able to segment those out. When we talk about segmentation, we're talking about isolating network traffic between systems that should only talk to what they're supposed to talk to for that given environment. So being able to isolate down, inspect the traffic at those areas, block, allow, so forth. So
thank you, Mike. It was a very comprehensive answer, and I really appreciate that. Now, Danielle mentioned something pretty interesting in when she was defining defense in depth, and one of them was the use of data, also the leverage data as part of the whole approach. And David, I know this is one of your specialties, like behavior analytics and how the behavior of the network works. So could you please expand a little bit on how that can be used in a defense in depth strategy?
Yes, as mentioned before, defense in depth means different layers of security, but almost always the human will be part of this equation. If it's insider threat, or it's the attacker uses social engineering to penetrate the network, etc. So when we assess the risk of network in the network and implementing the security solutions, we should try to understand how the human and the network entities interact. And then on this base, we can try to even detect unknown threats, 0 days, by using AI and machine learning to learn what is the common behavior of the users and the entities in the network, to learn the common interaction between them, and to detect unusual behaviors. Examples of unusual behavior can be accessing uncommon paths in the network, using unusual protocols, activity out of the working hours, and downloading large amount of data. To reduce the false alarms, the alert should be generated only if detecting several such activities. And if we're using anomaly detection, the anomaly should be only above certain thresholds. So again, to minimize the false alarms.
Thank you, David. Now, following into that, we have living for the past 2 years in a very unique situation. Many people are working from home, and actually, like many organizations are now expanded to software as a service, precisely as well. They were doing that digital change before, but now it's probably more. How does that impact defense in depth today, and probably how the techniques that you just mentioned could help with that?
Okay, so looking back, a few years ago, the perimeter of the enterprise was physical, and you can, defend the physical premises by fences and the guards and putting firewalls at the network perimeter and IDS, IPS, etc. But today, when some of the employees work at home and some of the enterprise assets sits in the cloud, the enterprise perimeter now is virtual. So the attack surface includes the enterprise premises, of course, but also the cloud service provider and the different endpoints like the employees, the customers, the suppliers, etc. So there are vulnerabilities that we should handle. There are many good tools for scanning and the network internally and externally and look for known vulnerabilities and the misconfigurations. And since different tools have different capabilities and qualities, my recommendation is to use a variety of tools and diffuse their results to get the best situation picture of the organization network.
Thank you, David. Now, it looks like there's a lot involved in putting together this whole strategy. So companies will have probably to balance the politics and the approach that they kind of set in place for that. And Daniel, you have a lot of experience dealing with organizations trying to put out security policies. How do you think companies can balance the different security priorities to put in place a strategy like this one?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A lot of the times when we think about these concepts in developing a mature security posture, we think that we have to have this common operating picture that has like a whole entire viewpoint of your organization at all times. And that kind of eagle-eye scenario sounds really good, but in practice, it actually breaks down very quickly because of resource constraints or different kind of communications protocols that were mentioned. And so what we focus on when we talk about any of these strategies really is the comprehension of interdependencies as they relate to the whole. And people tend to miss that the aspect of relating to the whole is the key takeaway there. So relating back to your individual risk profile rather than just focusing on maybe all the advanced persistent threats in the world and what they like to do. And so when I talk to organizations, I bring back to two pictures. I say, let's think about any of these strategies, defense in depth, for example, in two ways. How do we prevent a domino effect in your organization, regardless of the network we're talking about, where one thing can lead to another from any adversary or even from an accident or from an asset that is just kind of acting irregularly, right? Based on some of that AI and behavioral analytics we talked about. And the other one I look at is how do we identify some single points of failure, right, in your network that could cause, worse issues than even a known kind of CVE that we have out there. So I also say that you're only as secure as your weakest link. And something that hasn't been pointed out is that weakest link might not be your most critical vulnerability. So when CVEs come out and CVSS scores are kind of postulated, a lot of companies think, well, oh my gosh, I have to go patch that, right? And we've already talked about how patching is not technically the most ideal scenario in industrial operations for a number of reasons. But we forget the fact that then knowing that those vulnerabilities exist is not necessarily the weakest link in your organization. It could be something else. And so when you apply these strategies, you can root out those causes that are actually single points of failure or the potential for cascading impacts. And what it really comes down to for priorities is trust and partnerships. I'm glad that Mike and others picked up on that dynamic word, because I always, in talks that I give, bring people back to the physics definition of dynamic, which is constant change, activity, or progress. And you can't have constant change, activity, or progress without trust and partnerships. So that's kind of the starting point, getting rid of those static processes. You have to, have ongoing touch points with your program, with those different personas that were mentioned, and, look for incremental gains as they relate to the whole and your own kind of risk understanding, risk tolerance, et cetera. And the other thing I'll say, just because that's what we do at my company, is visibility is key. And it's kind of been mentioned before that it's not necessarily only that you can't protect what you can't see, but you also can't investigate any mishaps or accidents to understand those root causes. You have limited data to inform your risk profile and tolerance. There's little to no evidence to review for indicators of compromise if you don't have visibility. Again, having to rely on those patches that were talked about might not be feasible. And this is all actually happening at a time where components and connections continue to increase with multiple vendor systems and integrations. And then you add in kind of remote access and the growth of that. And then what Mike alluded to in the beginning was that, in OT, we have physical ramifications in the real world if things do go wrong. And so it requires that, information about communications and data traffic be understandable, but also operational data about functioning and the status of your equipment. And so I'll leave you with this. I like to tell people the difference between threat and asset intelligence. It's both are really critical. For me, threat intelligence is your check engine light, and asset intelligence is when your old Oldsmobile used to say the door is ajar. So I hope that helps to break down some of the prioritization.
It does. Thank you very much, Danielle. Now, we have talked about how to implement a whole preventive set to avoid these attacks. What happens if the attacks happens anyway? Because it could happen. It could happen that for some reason there was this smart hacker that make it through. What can companies do about it? Can they learn? Is there any type of procedure to act when something like this happens? And this is a question for the group. I don't know who wants to pick the answer.
I can start on this one perhaps, and then the people can chime in. Well, from a preventative perspective with response, first of all, it's creating a response plan. So when we think about companies, and so, with Regos, part of our offerings is we have IR teams and IR retainers. And so, I'm also blessed to be able to do tabletops and that kind of thing with different customers. So I see firsthand where, from a preventative side, and not as you're not preventing, it's more or less you're kind of in front of it. You're planning out an attack, and I think that a lot of companies these days, one of the things I try to tell folks is you don't get to choose if you're a good target. You also don't get to, say that if I put this in place, then I won't get attacked. So getting a front of this is coming up with, again, you're having a response plan in place. What happens if we do get compromised? What systems are critical for our environment? What do we have to rely on? And that goes into identifying a part of asset inventory, part of identifying your systems, knowing yourself, knowing your crown jewels. What are your most important systems within your environment that if that gets knocked off, compromised, it'll cause a plant outage or of your industrial system. So identifying those first. Again, we talk about defense in depth, getting controls around that. But then on the response piece, knowing how are we going to respond? What evidence are we going to be looking at? How do we know an adversary is in our environment? Oftentimes operations are the frontline folks. So have we trained our operations to, instead of saying, hey, this PLC is acting up, I'm just going to go flip the key switch to program and run, clear it out, and we'll start over. It's coming up with saying, it's informing your operations, your technicians to say, it might be cyber related. It may be an adversary related. And this isn't to introduce, fear, uncertainty, and doubt into your environment, into your people, but it's that in today's world, this is a reality we have to live with. And so it's first of all, it's training our staff to be aware of these type of occurrences that can happen. It's building out an incident response plan. It's working with your IT teams and your OT teams on response. OT requires a specific response plan, as a dedicated response plan, because response is completely different in OT than it is IT. In IT, it's normally, we're going to quickly reimage the system, get it back online, clean it up, we're done. OT, it's, well, can we run with this malware in our environment? If so, then we run with it. Or it's taking that decision that, hey, we have to begin isolating our networks really quick. pulling the cables across from that, perimeter firewall, running in isolation island mode, if you will. It's coming out with those response plans. It's also knowing where your backups are. So part of responsive recovery. So it's identifying, what are my critical systems? Do I have them backed up? Are my backups good? Have I tested them? Also, kind of the final point is visibility. And this is something that as I go through a lot of tabletops with customers, it's identifying, during that incident, it's where is the adversary? Can you say within your environment, I can see the adversary coming in, leveraging some sort of an open communication, leveraging some sort of vulnerability. Can I detect their command and control channel going back out, compromising my systems? Do I know which systems are compromised? Do I have to rebuild my entire DCS system or PLC SCADA system? Those type of things. To be able to answer that question, it comes back to host visibility, but more importantly, often network visibility, because a lot of these systems, you just don't have good host visibility. So it comes back to network security monitoring systems within your environment to understand what's talking to what's normal and what's changed. How are we responding to that? And then it's moving into what is in our systems. Can we get the information off so we can actually respond? So this is a really, really great question. And it's one that so many people right now are dealing with because we're seeing more and more and more compromises into these environments.
Thank you, Mike. We have a lot to talk about this topic, but unfortunately our time for today is up. We have been receiving some questions from our audience that we would like to share with you and see what we can respond to them. So let's have a quick moment to pass it to Matt while we list the questions that we are going to share with you today. Now, Matt, back to you.
Thank you all so much for that great presentation. And as Edgar mentioned, we are going to move into the questions and answer session now. If you have a question for us today, please go ahead and enter it into the Q&A window and hit submit. We will get to as many questions as we can today. If we do not have time for your question, don't worry, we will reach out to you following today's session. Edgar, I will pass it back to you and the group to answer some of our attendees' questions.
Thank you, Matt. And we're back with some questions from the audience. So the first one, I believe, goes to David. David, it says, well, now in the age of working from home, how do you recommend that organizations go about identifying attack surfaces and vulnerabilities?
Okay, so as mentioned before, the attack surface in the age of working from home is much more than was before, and includes the enterprise premises, and includes the cloud service providers, and also the different endpoints. So since the perimeter and the methods of working and accessing data and applications are changed today more than ever, it's important that we secure every layer of the organization. So we should secure the endpoints wherever they are, if they are at the organization itself or from home or from anywhere else. We should secure the remote channels to the enterprise assets, and it can be from the enterprise itself to the cloud or from the home to the cloud. The access to the applications in the cloud, wherever there are, and the access to the internet that can be done either from enterprise and from the home. And for each of these layers, there are very good tools that can be used to secure that channels.
Perfect. Thank you very much, David. We have another question that I think you can help us with that, Greg, given your background. So it says, legacy industrial control systems often include vendor relationships for longer periods of time than other industries, due to the types of components being used and other factors. Extended use of system components can often introduce security vulnerabilities. What approaches would you recommend in helping organizations track end-of-life hardware and software to ensure products are being updated timely?
That's a very relevant question today as customers try to modernize to support this digital transformation that everybody's going through. So a great place to start is more of a non-technical control would be to work with your trusted partner. Rockwell Automation could be one of those, to really do a install-based evaluation of your industrial operation. Take a look at all your assets, your policies, your procedures, whether it's maintenance procedures, operational procedures, whatever it's going to be, but also at the same time do some type of threat assessment to take a look at, again, your cybersecurity policies, procedures, your training, survey your network, take a look at your applications to see where are they at today for those. So it's a great place to start understanding where you're at. Just any journey, you have to know where you're at, and basically plot a journey to that point where you want to go. When it comes to technical controls, I would say asset management tools like FactoryTalk Asset Center is important to go out there and actually survey the network, to take a look at what revs are we looking at today, what type of devices, what firmware level revisions, what known security vulnerabilities may exist for those, things you may be able to do today to resolve those. But also when it comes to different types of network monitoring tools, like we've talked about visibility during the webinar multiple times, go out there and look at the data flows, take a look at packet analysis, what's really going on. Again, we have a lot of great tools that we'll work with our partners, whether it's Cisco with their CyberVision or Clarity with their continuous threat detection. So combination of both technical and non-technical controls to really do inventory of what you have today. Where am I starting? Where do I want to go?
Thank you, Greg. That's good. So the next question is for Mike. So it says, in the past, security training was primarily dependent on the physical location of components. With the introduction of cloud computing and remote access, security training is a necessary aspect of a business security strategy. Describe the evolution of security training and how you see it evolving in the industrial control industry.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. Well, first of all, security training, when we think about it, and most of the folks that are, have OT security roles, such as myself, and I'm sure many others, have come from some sort of maybe an automation or an IT background, but predominantly you start out with generic security training. You go to SANS classes, you go to whatever, maybe it's through your college and so forth. You've gotten up some sort of a base level knowledge from generic security practices. You know how to harden systems, networking and so forth, how firewalls work, encryption, and all these things. But the evolution then into OT systems is really so applying these security principles and practices to the context of OT, and that's where you really look at you begin to bring in your OT systems, such as your servers and workstations and PLCs and so forth, and understand the protocols and how to lock them down, how to do segmentation, those kind of things. So the training is really that. When you see it, it's in security in context of operational systems and the actual equipment on the plant floor. And then as we see, and to be very transparent, many of us, and myself included, are going through the shift now of cloud is not coming, cloud is here. And so so I'm having to be retrained just as everybody else is how do we do security for OT with cloud there? So, working with Azure, working with AWS systems and all those kind of things, understanding, ITOT, this cloud computing or FOD computing, edge devices and so forth, looking at these protocols and so forth. So it's that, we're just expanding our knowledge a little bit, refreshing ourselves a little bit, and pulling cloud into the play. But it all comes back down to understanding the context, security and context of these critical industrial systems. There's a lot of good training out there. Of course, you have vendor-specific training. There is, of course, ISA has some good courses. SANS has some excellent courses. I help teach with SANS on their industrial control systems security stuff. So there's a lot of opportunities out there for upskilling your staff in your companies, and it's just an exciting space right now for training.
Thank you, Mike. We have another question from the audience. Maybe this is the last one. Let's see what the time can afford us. So this question is for you, Daniel. It says, continuous monitoring approaches have been helping organizations with real-time monitoring to identify active cybersecurity attacks and minimize impact. Risk in the supply chain requires proactive approaches to identify weaknesses before products are actively in use. Where in the life cycle do you see opportunities for business to integrate more vigilant cyber practices?
Thanks, Edgar. There's a lot to unpack in that question. And I really liked Greg's response from the vendor perspective. We know that industrial and OT environments are multi-vendor environments, and that's a good thing, right? Because not everything connects. You don't have a single vendor, and not everything should connect to everything else in your environment. So in order to build trust with multiple vendors, you have to ask hard questions like you would in any other relationship. We know that trust is a social contract. So the other thing is that most attacks, not all, but most attacks are going to be opportunistic. And so there's this cost benefit analysis when you're going to be targeted, and we need to raise the cost. And so if everyone has the responsibility to make themselves a less attractive target, then that can trickle down across your supply chain. And you want to keep a multi-vendor ecosystem, because that, even though it technically increases the vectors, right, the attack landscape or the threat landscape, it also introduces a variety of ways that you can produce controls and kind of segment and all the other strategies we've talked about. And so you should be asking vendors about this. It should be kind of constant, right? Those long-term relationships are a good thing. You know them well. They've been a part of your ecosystem for 10, 20 years sometimes. And so you should be asking them, are the products you send to me, do they have security features that are enabled by default? If they're disabled by default, why? How does that fit into my risk profile, right? Have these conversations. Can they recommend controls and approaches for things that they know to be insecure or to be questionable? Do they have a vulnerability disclosure program, right? I always caution folks that if there's not a way to disclose vulnerabilities, or if a company or a vendor says, we've never had an incident, that's a red flag to me, right? Like they should be open and transparent about vulnerabilities that are disclosed and patched and how they address that situation. Another thing I would say that goes back to the continuous monitoring is that CVSS scores, which I mentioned before, as they apply to your organization and your independent risk profile and tolerance, is actually really fuzzy. So the score will come out and it'll be given kind of a rating of how important it is or how severe it could be, but that's based on the vulnerability itself and the system that it applies to. But I could have 6 of those machines, I could have 1,000 of those machines. And so I might need to go back to the vendor to understand that risk profile, or I'll go to my monitoring tool, somebody like Nozomi, and say, hey, can you help me understand, given my environment, how does this really apply to me? Is it that important? Like Mike said, is this is there malware that I can live with technically in my operation? And I'll tell a little story, which is I saw a remote area in Texas where, based on those conversations with the vendor, the best solution for them wasn't to go manual. It wasn't to restore from backup. It was actually to have a separate disconnected HMI on hand. And we talk about, rip and replace is not a good strategy, but because of the conversations that were ongoing and the trust in this vendor system and how remote and ruggedized these systems have to be sometimes, the best option for this organization was actually to have a spare machine on hand, right? And so those conversations and those outcomes can only be conclusions that are drawn if you have ongoing trust developed in those relationships. And also it's why asset intelligence is so important. We've come back to this a couple of times. You need to be able to identify the difference between an actual potential cyber threat and attack, or maybe a misconfiguration or an accidental update push from IT, or something that is a remote access from the vendor itself, right? That's technically trusted, but it could be hijacked. So it really all comes down to trust and relationships, which I think we said a couple of times now. So,
thank you very much, Danielle. And well, that concludes our panel discussion about defense in depth today. So, Danielle, David, Greg, and Mike, thank you very much for joining us today and share your knowledge and experience with the audience. To our audience, also, thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope to see you here in our next panels. And we are also grateful to Roundtable and their efforts to make infrastructure and industrial networks safer against cybersecurity attacks. And finally, for globalspec.com, thank you to the millions of technical professionals, engineers who have allowed us to connect them to the parts and services they need for project success. So with that said, back to you, Matt.
Thank you, Edgar. Now just a few items before we end things today. I would like to say a huge thank you to all of the panelists today and to Edgar for leading our discussion. And a special thank to Rockwell Automation for sponsoring this Cybersecurity for Industrial Systems series. Today was session 1 out of our 4-part series. Please join us for the rest of our sessions. You can visit our series page using the link listed in the resource widget. Sign up for all of the sessions today. You won't want to miss it. And one last thank you to our audience members for being here with us today. You will be receiving an email from us with a link to the on-demand version of this presentation, so you will be able to come back and watch this again or share it with your colleagues. Again, thank you for taking the time to attend this Global Spec series. Take care, and we will talk with you soon.